In this one, we'll be building a hotel reservation UI. If I click this button, the whole calendar pops up, which is dynamically populated by counting today and the dates forward. I can switch between the months and I can select some of the dates and a starting triangle will appear, and select an end date, an ending triangle will appear. These are signaling the afternoons of arrival and the mornings of departure. In the middle, all of those are fully selected. I can click on select. If I insert some data, I will be able to select those. Meanwhile, the nights and the total cost of the reservation will also be calculated. I can send the booking requests, and the ones that I've selected will get added to an array of dates, which are the preoccupied date. There are also some other dates that are already in the preoccupied dates. As you can see, if I switch the months, it remembers it. It will be built using only HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, so it's fully integratable anywhere. I hope you're excited, and let's get started. Down in the description, I will be providing a starting and a finished code. This will be our GitHub repo, and the way for you to use it is by either entering the starting, which will have the main logic ripped out of it. We'll be starting with this, and then there will be the finished code, which you can always have a look at. If you click on it, there will be the PNG that we'll be using. There will be the index.html and the styles.css, as well as the booking.js, which I'll be explaining in full detail throughout the video. So if you're ready to get started, grab either the starting or the finished code, and I will explain how everything is set up and why they are doing what they are doing. I've opened up VS Code and I've imported the starting files that we have. On the left, you'll be seeing the project in the meanwhile, and on the right, I hope it's fairly visible. You'll be able to work along with me, or at least watch me explain how things are set up. The base functionality of the starting files is just simply showing you the explore and book, and nothing else is functional because it's all dynamically populated from JavaScript. Starting with the HTML, all we have here is a region for the navbar. The whole code is based on regions, so it's structured well. We have the script and the CSS inserted. Make sure that it's with defer, because then I can put it to the head tag. Otherwise, the script would be coming before the end of the body. There is the landing section. This is the button and the call to action. And then there is the calendar region. The calendar region has the calendar nav, which is basically the header of it, where there are the two buttons and a div signaling the current year. Then there are the other headers like book your stay and the book selected model, and there is the calendar div, which we'll be heavily using because we'll be populating some data over here. Other than that, there is the booking dialog, which you saw when I was showcasing it. It's the send booking request. It's nothing too crazy. It's just a form and some buttons. So let's have a little bit of look at our CSS as well. In our CSS, we have some basic settings for the body and a font imported. This is what I like to use. There is a region set up for the navbar. This is a not responsive navbar. There are only 3 links over here. It's just to give a little bit of outline for our UI. You can have a look at it in your own time. It's pretty straightforward. There is the landing section, which is basically our background image and the buttons that toggle this little UI that appeared over here. And then there is the calendar section. The calendar section is also rather basic. It uses a grid system to lay out the elements, and there are some polygon shapes as well. There will be 3 classes that are heavily used. One is the disabled class, which basically just disables the UI and won't let you handle any pointer events. There is the day.full, which basically means it's fully occupied. It's also visually interpreted over here. And then there are 2 more, which is the day.afternoon and the day.morning. They have before and after elements, and they represent a certain polygon. This is the triangle that I showed you. And the overflow hidden, it's commented over here, is given so it does not overflow. The CSS is also overall rather straightforward, so you can have a look at that in your own time. As for the model, there are also nothing too crazy here, so we'll jump onto our JavaScript. The JavaScript is also broken up into regions, and we'll be extending this as we go along. In the JavaScript, the first region is the landing toggle. This is basically just us clicking the button and this UI appearing. We are toggling a class called hidden, and that hidden will hide the buttons and the CTA section, and it will toggle off the hidden from the calendar so that this UI on the left appears. The booking calendar logic will have multiple regions. First of all, there will be a starting variables. In the starting variables, we are grabbing some basic data with the IDs and the query selector. We are grabbing the calendar element. which will be receiving some elements to it later. There is the current month here, which is basically just the display in our main app over here, May 2025. There are the buttons for the previous and the next one. They are predefined over here. We grab these elements basically. There is a today date because it's important to know what date is today, so we can plot out the months and the calendar later. We will be working in UTC format because that's a date format that's generally accepted, and that date format can be then converted to local time later if you want to do that. But it's important that you always work with the same format of dates, because otherwise you'll be having comparison issues. And the today is got by creating a new date with the date constructor. And inside that, to make it robust and make sure it's always UTC, we create a date.utc. And inside that we get the year, the month, and the date all in UTC format. This may not be the most resourceful way of doing it, but it's a very robust way to do so. We also get the current month and the current year just by grabbing it from the today.getUTCMonth and getUTC full year. And there are 3 more variables that are for the selection. Over here, as you see, if I click one of the selected elements, the others behind it will get disabled. This selecting start is true by default because the first click on the calendar will be your start date. So when I click the start date will get set. And when I click the second time, the end date will also be set. Now that we've brushed through the starting variables, there will be an array. This is where you would normally integrate your database. This array is an array of occupied dates. It contains objects which have start dates and end dates. And from these start dates and end dates, we calculate each occupied day. As you see, this month is fully occupied. And this is not enough because we might get the data fetched from the database unordered. So we are sorting the data in an ascending format, but the sort method by default is usually for strings. It's not for sorting numerical data. For that, we have to override it a little bit. AB is representing the first element that's getting sorted and the second element. And this is how JavaScript documentation says to do so. We return a new date in this format. This is the isostring format. It's something that's easier to work with. The T represents the time. So these are now hours, minutes, and seconds. And before that, there is the A.startDate and the B.startDate, because this sort, of course, receives these objects and you can refer to them. And we sub out of the A, the B value, and this way they get sorted accordingly. One thing to note is that this sort method mutates the array in place, meaning we don't have to assign the array to the sorted version, it mutates the original array. I hope this was understandable. If something is not understandable, please comment it down below and I'll be happy to help you out. We'll move on to our helper functions. In the helpers function, we have one helper function that we'll be using many times, and this is the normalized date. As I said, and I actually showed you here, this is the isostring format. You see there is a T which will split for us the time, and we don't actually always need to know the time. For that, we have this normalize function which converts a certain date to an isostring, for example, a year, month, day format to an isostring, and then splits this T and then gets this year, month, day format. This is needed because usually you don't pass in a normal formatted date here, but the constructed date from the UTC time. And this is just basically how you get this format that we'll be using out of it. There is also another function that's for clearing our selections, because as I said, we have the days which will be constructed. These are all individual days, and they have either the afternoon, the morning, the full, or the disabled class. Now this one removes all of those. It finds all the days and removes any of these classes. And the disable fully occupied tiles is for searching the days, and if it either has a full, that means the day is fully occupied, or if it has a morning class and an afternoon class available at the same time, then those will get automatically disabled. That's because if someone is leaving, for example, on the morning, you can still book for the afternoon of that because you can arrive by that afternoon. And with the helper functions wrapped up as well, we have to do the main calculations. So there will be a region for the main calculations in the finished code. You can have a look at that and follow along with me. Moving on, in the main calculations region, we have a function for updating our calendar. Whenever you switch between months, you'll always be needing to update your calendar because there is always 30, 31 or 28 days in the calendar and you have to repaint those. For that, the first thing that we'll be doing is setting the calendars in our HTML to be empty. Remember, the calendar is the one with the calendar class, which we've got above in the starting variables. There is also the today. And the next thing that I like to do is get how many days are there in the current month. To do that, we have 3 lines over here. One of them is getting the first date. We will construct a new date of the date.utc. We are grabbing the current year, the current month, and the first day of that. And this will construct as a new date of the first day. And then there will be a last day, which will also be constructed the same way, but instead of giving the first day of it, we are giving the 0 index day, and we are actually looking for the current month. So if it's September right now, then we insert October over here and its 0 indexed element. By indexing its 0 indexed element, we are actually getting the last day of September. With this, we have our last day, and we are storing the days in the month as the last day.getUTC date. The getUTC date will always give you back a number between, for example, 1 to 31. This is because if it's the first and you for that day you say getUTC date, it will say 1. But if it's the last, it will say 31, 30, 28, whatever the last day is. And now we have to put these into use. The first one is grabbing the current month year, which is an element that we've grabbed in the starting variables. It's the header that displays which year are we in, and setting its text content. It's like setting its inner HTML basically, but it's resistant to injections. And we are setting the first day.toLocal string. We are going to set it to be default, but you can put a country over here. And we are looking for the months. So basically, if we have here, for example, 1 to 12 numbers, and by saying month to be long, we are actually saying from January to December with strings. And then after that, we simply put the current year. To see that this actually take effect, I will call the update calendar function by default. With this, we have January 2025 over here inserted. Another thing that I like to do is disable the previous month button if the current year is today's current year and the current month is today's current month, because we don't want to go back in the past, because a booking UI app wouldn't care about going back in the past. You don't want to see, or the users don't want to see what others have selected. The next task that this function will do is going with a for loop from 1 to the days in months, meaning we are going to the end of the month. And in this for loop, we'll be creating the little tiles for our dates. First of all, I'll create a day div with the document.create element, and it will be the type div. And we are also assigning the day class to them, which in CSS is basically just a way of formatting our tiles. I will also create a span, and this span will be with the document.create element span, and it will contain as the text content the I element. The I element is basically just a number from 1 to the number of days that you have in the for loop and in the month. So these will be our numbers, but we still haven't appended these. So what I'll do is say daydiv.appendChild and the span element. We also have to append the whole day div. So I also do calendar.appendChild day div. With this, if you open up the UI, you should have your little tiles set up like this. Now we do have a little bit of a problem here. We can select dates, or at least click on dates that are past. For example, I shouldn't be able to select the 1st of January because it's already the 2nd of January, and I don't want to select the 2nd as well. This is something you can decide on your own. So before we append this span to this element, there are a few lines I'd like to paste in here. What each of these do is getting the date string out of these is basically by saying the current year and then getting the current month and pet starting it by 2 zeros. And then another dash and pet starting the I element with 2 zeros. If I console log this out for you, you'll see what this actually formats. If you look in the console over here, you are able to see that it's 2025-01 15 and all these dates linked up over here. And we are storing this type of data in the dataset.date. The dataset is a place where you can store string type data and later access it from the elements. And now after that we can handle the disabling of those certain dates. The day date will be a new date with the date string given over there, and this is formatted into an ISO string format with the T given over here. And if the day date is less than today, meaning it has already passed, it's in the past, then we give the disabled class to that. I've also inserted another piece of functionality over here that if we have a start date and don't have an end date yet, and the day date is less than the starting date that we selected, this will be with the selection that we'll be working on in a minute, then we want to add the disabled class as well. This is because if you select a start date, we don't want to enable you to select dates in the past as the end date, because that wouldn't make sense. And with this, basically, if I open this up, you'll be able to see that the 1st of January is already disabled because it's already in the past. The next little functionality that we'll be working on is switching between the months and rendering out the calendar days. And for that, I've actually moved the update calendar to this event listeners region. You'll be able to find it like this in the source code. And here's a little bit of functionality that we'll be doing. We are adding event listeners to both the previous and the next month. These will be click event listeners. And in the previous one, we are decreasing the current month. And if the current month is less than 0, then we'll switch it to be 11. And the current year will also be decreased. That means we are switching years. And then after each call of this, we are updating the calendar. On the next month click, we are doing the opposite. We are incrementing the current month. And if it's greater than 11, we'll set it back to 0 because we are indexing from 0 here and then calling the update calendar. To test this functionality out, I will simply start clicking these buttons, and as you see, it's working perfectly. The dates are getting rendered out properly. And I won't be able to go into the past, I won't be able to go below January. The next function we'll be writing is for handling the date selection. It won't be visualized yet, so we won't be able to see it, but we'll be console logging out the result. This function will receive a day div, and we'll be utilizing that div, and we'll be getting the selected date out of that date that was passed in. And the reason this is important is because we have to hook this up with an event listener up above. When we append these children, before we actually do that, we have to add an event listener of click, and the handle day selection will be passing in itself. That's why we are able to access the dataset over here. Now we have to make an if statement. We are going to execute some functionality if we are selecting the start date. For that, we'll be relying on the selecting start, which is, if you remember, a boolean value that's set to true by default, meaning the first click will be selecting the start date. We have a guard statement up above here, where we are looking for a date with the similar start date, meaning if we selected a start date that was already in the occupied dates array, which is basically the predefined array that you fetch from the database, then you return and we say that the arrival date is already booked, so you won't be able to select that date over there. Otherwise, we are selecting the selected date, which is basically what we've got out in an ISO string format from the day div. This will be the start date. The end date will be reset to null. This is because if we've already selected an end date before, and this is, for example, our second or any other start date selection, we set it back to null. We'll call the clear selection. This will be in the future when we are actually highlighting the tiles. Then we clear all those selections and we call the update calendar. And we also set the selecting start to be false, so we can the next time select the end date. Here comes the other part, where if we are selecting the end date, we insert an else block, and if the selected date is less than the start date, or we are selecting the start date itself, then we alert that this is not a valid date. Next, we have to check if the selection is overlapping with some other selections, because that can cause some serious problems. There will be a boolean value that we get back, which will be the const no overlaps. We are checking with the every function, which gives back a boolean value based on if every object in that certain array is applicable the certain condition that we give, then it gives back true, otherwise it gives back false. For this function, we'll be passing in an arrow function which receives the occupied date. This is the function. And here we are checking some overlapping logic. This is something that you'll be able to find in one of the Stack Overflow posts. That's where I found it myself. Is overlapping we are checking if the normalized date start date is greater than the occupied date start date. And it's important that this is basically a for loop because the every loops through all of the occupied date. And then we are checking if the start date is less than the end date. So basically we are checking if the intervals intersect each other. Are they overlapping? And we return not is overlapping. So we have to make sure that none of these is actually overlapping. That's why we are putting a not over here. And then the no overlaps will be true. But if we are overlapping, then we return. Otherwise, if we are not, we simply set the end date to the selected date and the selecting start to be true. Now, if this logic is not understandable, please think about it a little more. Basically, we are checking the intervals against each other. This is how you do it in real life. You just have to break it down. And at the end, we are calling the update calendar. Before we call the update calendar though, I'll console.log out the end date and the start date. So start date plus something like this and plus end date. This is a little better formatted, so we'll be able to select explore and book. I select the 10th and the 15th and then bring up the developer tools. And in the developer tools, you will see that the first time I selected a start date, the end date was still null. You can see it over there. And the other time I selected a start date, this is our start date, and then there was the end date selected as well and logged out with the little separator that I've put over there. I hope it's visible in this little. With this, we basically have a way of selecting the start and the end date without actually checking if we are overlapping or not. And now we should be able to get to visualizing this and actually highlighting the tiles. So the next function will be for calculating the actual highlight range. Because okay, we have the start and the end date selected, but what if those start and end dates actually overlap? For example, if we select something from a different month, then how do you handle that? For that, we have to properly calculate the highlight range that needs to be actually shown to the user in the current month. For that, there will be this calculate highlight range, which receives the occupation. The occupation is an object with a start and end date given. It receives the current month, the current year, and the last day of the current month. First, we have to get the start date and the end date in an ISO string format. It's just the usual, nothing too crazy. Now there is an if statement that we have to make. Let's start with the else. If we are not overlapping in the months, then we simply return the start and the ending date. It's simple. But if we are not in the current month, that as of today's date, and we are not in the current year, for example, or we are not in the current year, then we have to calculate the ranges. Let's get started with the calculations. There will be a D, which will be a new date of the starting date. And there will be a month start date, which will be set to null by default. And what we have to do here is find from where to where are we going to show it based on the current month. For that, we'll be needing a while loop. While we haven't found the starting date for this month, and the D as the date is still less than or equal to the ending date, we are going to continue our loop. We'll store the starting date of the month over here in the start month date. If the date.getUTC month is equal to the current month and the year is also the current year, then the month start date will be a new date and we'll set its UTC date to be its current UTC date plus 1. This way we are calculating the overlap between the months and whether we should start at a new month or not. And now we have to return some data. If the ending date.getUTC month is greater than the current month, that means it's in a different month, or the year is different, then we are going to return an object like this, where the start is the month start date and the end is the last date. Otherwise, if the end date is not in a different month, then we are going to return the month start date with the ending date. This is more like a utility function because we won't be calling it just plainly like this. We'll be including it in other functions. The next function will be same with a similar structure, but this will contain the logic for highlighting and visualizing those selected tiles. The next function is going to be another kind of utility function, which is going to be the highlight range. It will be the one that actually colors the tiles when selected, and it will receive a start date and end date, and it will receive some optional parameters. The start triangle and the end triangle will be set to true. We can manipulate these, and based on the current values, we'll give the corresponding classes like morning, afternoon, or full to the given tiles. We'll start with a security guard. If there is no start date selected, then we return. Then we have to get all of the days out, and this will be with the query selector. Then we loop over these days, and with the for each loop, which will be passed in the day, first of all, I'd like to get the date in an ISO string format, like this. We are handling an edge case over here, that if we do not have an end date selected and the start date is the same as the day date, which is basically we've just selected the first starting date, then we add the afternoon class. Let me show it to you in action. Here in the working one, if I select this one, the 16th, there will be an afternoon class given to this element, and only after I click further do we get actually a morning class and the full classes in between. After this security edge case is confirmed, we have a bunch of other ifs to deal with. First of all, if the end date is set and the normalized day date and the day date is greater than the start date, and the day date is also less than the end date, meaning we've selected a normal range, then we can check whether we have a different type of settings. We are checking, like we did before, if we are selecting actually the start date, then, and if we have a start triangle selected as well, or given as the optional parameter, then we give the afternoon class. Otherwise, if we are selecting the end date and we have the end triangle set as true, then we give the morning class. Otherwise, if both of these optional parameters are false, then we give out the day.classlist.add full, meaning all of them should be full. This is important when we are selecting, for example, from 1 month that overlaps altogether another full month, and it goes down to the 3rd month, then the in-between month that we fully occupied will be also always set to be the full class. I don't know if it's very understandable, but this gives us a very good functionality. For example, like here we have the first selected, it goes over this month, this whole month is now occupied, and it ends in the 3rd month. This way, all of these are shown without any actual break in character because they are all full classes. Now with these two set up, we can move on to a persistent user selection that we'll be using. The parameters of this function are going to be the same as the calculate highlight range. At first, we are only going to execute code if we have a start date and an end date given out as well. We'll be calling the calculate highlight range, and we'll be destructuring this with the start and end parameters, whatever it returns. And we have the start date and the end date passed in with the normalized date as the first parameter. We have the current month, current year, and the last day passed in as well. Basically, we are just calling this function. Then if we couldn't calculate or something went wrong, then if not start and not end, then we return. And now we have 2 lines for calculating whether we need to display a fully classed tile or a triangle classed tile on the end and on the start, because if the start is greater than the normalized date start date, that means it's probably in another month, then we actually have to display a full tile over there and also a full length in the opposite direction. And then based on these 2 variables, if they are both true, then we simply call the highlight range with false and false. Otherwise, we call the highlight range with start and false and true. And then we also call it with the other variant. Otherwise, we'll just call it simply. This is, as I've explained, the visual representation of the highlight range that we've just done before. And I actually messed up the curly braces over here because we have to move all of this, cut it, and move it inside the if statement. And we need another else if statement given. If we are selecting only the start date and we don't have an end date, then we'll simply highlight the range with start date and null, because we've covered this in the highlight range that if we don't have an end date selected, we will still be able to highlight those ranges. Now with these functions done, the user should be able to select. So move back to your update calendar, and in the end, after this if statement, simply call persist user selection. Pass in the start date, the end date, the current month, the current year, and the last day. These are all calculated. So if we give it a try, I should be able to select, but we are getting an error if you did it like I did, and that's simply because all of this from the if statement needs to be cut out, and it's complaining in the inspector that day date is not defined. We have to put it inside the for each loop, otherwise it won't make sense. Now let's give this a try. And I am able to select, as you see, that little triangle over there got highlighted. And I can highlight freely the other one. I am able to highlight the tiles next to each other. I am able to highlight full months. It's just that I'm booking over already booked dates because we have overlapping functionality implemented. So if I move on to somewhere where I surely haven't occupied anything, I select the first, go 2 months ahead and select the 31st, and it is selecting all of them properly, and the calendar gets updated properly. So this is also working. Now what we have to do is visualize the already selected dates that we get from the database or that are predefined. The last function according to the calendar we'll be writing is the highlight occupied dates. It receives the same set of parameters as all of the other functions before. This is a little bit redundant. I know you can refactor the code if you want to, but I spent a lot of time with it and it was working for me. What we'll be doing in here, as I said, is quite redundant. We are going over the occupied dates with a for each loop, and each of them will give back an occupation, and we are basically doing the same calculations as we did before, even the same checks, and we are displaying them based on whether the display full start and the display full end are needed or not. And we have to call this function in the update calendar up above. So in the update calendar above the persist user selection, we'll call the highlight occupied dates. There we receive the occupied days, the current month, current day, and the last year. And I will also call the disable fully occupied tiles. This is so that you are not able to click on those tiles if they are fully selected. Now if we have a look, there are some tiles which are already off, so I won't be able to click them. And if I start going over, I see that the predefined months here are displayed just as well. They are perfectly visualized right there. I can select the arrival for the second and select forwards. So this is just as I showed you in the demo. We are basically done with the calendar. All we need to do is hook it up with a little modal so that the user is actually capable of adding new occupied dates. For that, we have to come back to our index.html. Here is the dialog that we'll be working with. This is the one we'll be working on, so I just wanted to show you that the CSS corresponding to that is also highlighted in the CSS file, and what we'll be needing is coming all the way down. In a new region, in the modal logic region, there will be some starting variables where we grab the dialog, the open modal, close modal dialog button, and the submit booking button, and also there is a scroll top for 0. You'll see why in a minute, because that's in the helper functions. We have two functions that disable and enable scrolling, because when you select some dates or at the process of wanting to book your dates, I don't want the user to be able to scroll in the meanwhile. That's why we have disable scrolling and enable scrolling over here. The first two are rather straightforward, and the third is a nights between dates, where we calculate how many nights are there between a start and an end date. These are a few calculations you can have a look at, but they are pretty straightforward, and these are only helper functions. Finally, in here we have another region which is going to be our event listeners. I will be breaking down each of these event listeners one by one. First will be an open modal button, which has a click event listener. If we don't have a start date or an end date selected, then we say that please select one. When this first fires, we disable the scrolling. We select the date range and set its inner HTML. we select the modal content and select the HTML of that as well. We have 350 as a magic number over here for the price, but overall we are just selecting some things over here and changing their inner HTML. We calculate the nights with the nights between helper function, and we select the nights price as well as the how many nights are there actually staying. Basically, this part which I've highlighted over here is nothing but HTML DOM manipulation. And then there is a show model for the dialog because it's of type dialog. And this is a built-in function in HTML. This will show us the modal. And we add the hidden class to it, the hide class to it by default, because I wanted to have a subtle animation. And we only after 10 milliseconds do we actually remove the hide and add the show class to it. This will make sure it's animated nicely. You can omit this if you don't want it to be animated and just go with dialog.show modal. The close button is going to be rather similar. We remove the show, add the hide back. And after an event listener is done, for example, 300 milliseconds, which is the transition duration, then we close the dialog and enable scrolling once again. There is another one that's a little one that's helpful, is that if you click anything that's not basically the event or the modal, then we close the dialog button. This is if I open this up and select some dates, then if I click away, it will still close. And then there is the submit booking button, which is also rather straightforward. All we are doing here is calling the e.prevent default because this is a submit button, and we are also calling the occupied dates.push, which means we are adding a new element to the end of the array where we set the start date and the end date with the normalized date functions. We console log out, which can be omitted if you want to, and then we just simply reset all of these and close the whole dialog button with the click function. Essentially, you could also reset the form values, and we also update the calendar after this one because now that we've added to the occupied dates, we need to repaint and recalculate which dates are occupied. And that's basically it for this little app. If I open it up, we should be able to do everything we did before. So I select these, I say book selected, and you can see that these are auto calculated. I can send the booking request and they will get booked, and I can start selecting some new ones. So basically nothing is broken, everything is working as I showed you in the preview, and we've gone through the explanation of the code. I hope you put it to good use, and if you found value in this video and would like to see more, please consider giving us a like, maybe even subscribe. Other than that, I hope to see you in the next one. Happy coding and God bless.